our next session is Working with Media, Tips for Researchers, Patients, Families, and Living Donors. We're going to dive right into the program. I want to welcome three members of the CDTRP Media Committee, Linda Powell, Heather Badenoch, and Elaine Yong online. Linda Powell, a former physiotherapist, had a successful career with Stars Air Ambulance and served on charitable boards. After retiring, she became a caregiver for a family member with end-stage liver disease and now actively advocates for organ donation in Alberta as the chair of the Alberta Organization Group. Heather Badenoch is a non-directed living liver donor and communication strategist. As the president of Village PR, she provides strategic communications, direction, and training to non-for-profit clients in community and health. Elaine Yong is a CDTRP patient partner, communications manager at BC Transplant, and caregiver to a pediatric heart transplant recipient. With a background in journalism and over 2 decades of experience in newsrooms, she transitioned into healthcare communications in 2015. Thank you.
Thank you, Siva and Vanessa, for those kind introductions. Welcome, everybody. Great group. We're really excited to present this workshop this morning. It's going to be dynamic, lots of content, tricks and tips, and very importantly, we hope to open the doors for all to media engagement and its opportunities and some challenges from time to time within the context of an overall communication strategy in our organizations. So how did this workshop come to be? So leading up to today has been about an 18-month or so journey within CDTRP, recognizing that a component of communication, specifically media engagement, could strengthen CDTRP's impact and reach in knowledge mobilization and public education. So on the screen here, you see 2 workshops. We started about a year and a half ago with 2 workshops. The first was learning from each other. And the idea was to bring together media and ODT experts to provide tools and share information on conveying clear messaging. And we've listed a few bullets there, leading to greater collaboration, contributing to a stronger culture of donation, and huge participation in the presentations. The second one was a month later, engaging the public online during policy change. And the intent of that one was to investigate and share the complexities of hosting and moderating social media discussion and responding to misinformation, which we all know politically and socially is a big challenge these days. We had some incredible presenters in those 2 workshops. In the first one, Belén Velasco Conquero from the Spanish network, Transplantation Network, spoke, head of communications there. Tim Caulfield, who a lot of us know from the University of Alberta Law Institute and very involved in misinformation. Stephen Bede from Nova Scotia, among others. And then in the second session, Alessandro Marcon joined us, who has a specialty in social media. So the next workshop was at the ASM in December last year. And we spent the summer sort of planning out what was going to happen for the third one and had a very strong, engaging 1-hour session with a large group like this, talking about the opportunities to strengthen collaboration between organizations and knowledge translation, again, enhancing the culture of donation, enhancing public education. And at that workshop, we shared what different programs we're doing in different organizations and disseminating information to the public, the strengths and limitations of interacting with the media, and the need to work collaboratively together. The CDTRP mission and purpose very clearly enunciate the need for within its work to carry out knowledge mobilization. And you see that word throughout the mission and the purpose. And I grabbed a few statements from the purpose statement to identify that it was repeated a number of times. So knowledge mobilization is a very important strut of CDTRP's work, and how can media engagement be part of that? At the meeting in Kelowna, a few key underlying principles were emphasized in this whole process. And Murat Sasarev gave the introductory comments, and he made these 4 points: was integrate new knowledge into public discourse, collaborate and network to promote research, focus on the priorities of patient, family, donor partners, which is so important for CDTRP, and to build trust. And as we all know, it takes a long time to build trust. It takes hard work to maintain trust, and we can lose it very quickly. So how to engage with media and how to do that in an appropriate manner with the right resources and the right people and the right training is really important. So as a follow-up from the ASM in December in Kelowna, a media committee was struck and our first meeting was held in April. And at this moment in time, I'd like to recognize the committee members who worked really hard over the past 6 months. Our last meeting was about 2 weeks ago, and we engaged over 6 or 7 meetings and also lots of work offline as well. And would like to recognize the external consultants who were available to us, Murat Sasarev, Aviva Goldberg, and Sandra Holsworth. We had access to them as well in terms of carrying out the work of the committee. So thank you to everybody. So what did we do? There was 2 outcomes from the media committee work. One was to develop a process to support researchers to determine the best communication channels through which to communicate their work and their results. And of course, that speaks to targeted audiences and specific purposes and goals of knowledge mobilization. And certainly Heather and Elaine are going to be speaking in depth to that. If media is one of the tools, it's not the only tool. If it's one of the tools that's chosen for the communication strategy for knowledge mobilization, then we needed a roadmap for that. So one of the other outcomes of the committee work was to develop a roadmap for media engagement. And that tool is now in place. And as with everything, when it's implemented, it starts being fine-tuned and evaluated and fine-tuned, and that will happen over time. But it's now within the purview of CDTRP and implementing it. So here we are. We put forward from the committee, we put forward to the Annual Scientific Planning Committee to hold a workshop here on media training, and it was accepted. So we're about to undergo media training. And we had 2 experts on our committee, communication strategists and specialists, Heather Badenoch and Elaine Yong. And we're just thrilled that you're able to provide this very dynamic, engaging workshop. So be prepared to receive lots of information and lots of great ideas on how to move forward. Over to you.
We say good morning to Elaine because it is early o'clock in where she is.
Good morning, everyone.
I understand her household is asleep, ringers are off, but she is graciously here. So thank you for the kind introductions that we've already received. We are together today until 12:30. We promise to make it interesting as possible. So as you can see, there is a lot that we are going to cover, and we're very much looking forward to working through all of this with you. To start with, a show of hands, please. And so online, you can raise your hands there as well. And then, but just in the room as well, how many of you have done 1 or more media interviews? Show of hands, terrific. And then keep your hand up if you feel like it went well. Pretty good, all right. How many of you would like to get better? Yes, okay, love. So we're going to talk about choosing the right channels and tools. So being strategic in your communications right from the start. We have heard, I have certainly heard many times in the past few days, our goal is raising awareness. We're going to raise awareness. And my question when someone says that is always, once someone is aware, what do you want them to do? So awareness is in fact an important starting point, but not the end result. And so when we talk about awareness or reputation or trust, that's great. That's a key place because people need to have heard of you or heard of your work, right? And then we talk about having some sort of contact. So someone clicks like on a social media post, they sign up for your newsletter, right? But if we manage those things, we're selling ourselves short. These are vanity metrics. A Facebook like, a Twitter, an X retweet, whatever we call it now, is pretty, but not the actual outcome, is it? And so we don't measure those things. We need to actually think about measuring what it is we're truly aiming for. So when we do knowledge translation on research, when we communicate the results of our research, what are we aiming for? Probably policy change, a change in practice, more families consent to deceased donation. Personally, I want to see more people be living donors like me, right? So when we start approaching our communications, we're thinking about what are the research goals, because this is where we're starting from. And then what are the goals of our communications and our knowledge translation? What are we trying to aim for when we do that? And then who is it that we're actually talking to, right? So if you've had a conversation with me at all in the past few years, you know that I really dislike the words general public. Like, who the heck is that? Right? So who are we communicating to? And then once we know who we're communicating to, what are the best channels to reach them through? And so we think about, for example, I know there's a lot of text here. Are we communicating to provincial and federal politicians, hospital administrators, because we're trying to get some sort of policy or legislative change? And what are the best channels to reach them, right? So maybe it's meetings and emails, but then we know that a good Globe and Mail article puts the pressure on, right? Or we're thinking about communicating to fellow transplant researchers and clinicians. And so we think about like journals and conferences. So we're being really strategic in terms of who is the target audience and what is the best way to reach them. And sometimes the answer is media.
Hi, everyone. Before I get started, I just want to say I'm joining you today from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. And I am honored to be an uninvited guest on these beautiful lands. For any of you who are from the West Coast or have been to the West Coast, it really is the best coast. And it's an absolutely, beautiful place to be. And I think especially during the pandemic, really realized just what a special place, and the Indigenous people who have cared for these lands for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And now I get to live, work, and play here. So sorry I'm not able to join you in Montreal, but here you guys are having a wonderful time, and I'm happy to be able to join you today from Vancouver. So I know that Linda talked about the process that we went through for the media committee, and that we had put together a framework, as well as one of the key pieces I think that will be useful, hopefully, to the research community in the future is a request form. And it kind of basically walks you through the process and sort of forces you to think of some of those things that Heather was talking about in terms of, what is the purpose of this communication thing that you want? What are you trying to achieve? And allows the CDTRP to hopefully hone in on what it is that might actually support your communications needs. So watch for that coming in the months ahead. Next slide, please. So, it's very interesting because, Heather was saying, a lot of people talk about raising awareness, and then sort of the other piece that goes along with that is that, well, we must get a story in the Globe and Mail or on the news. But you know what? The reality is the media landscape is very, very different than it was. And this traditional idea that a lot of us are married to still, where we're like, if it's not in the traditional media, then we were unsuccessful. But really stop and think about where you get your news. How many of you actually get a newspaper or read the newspaper? Maybe you read it online, maybe, before when you could actually look at their social media feeds. Maybe a lot of you got your news through there. But the reality is that actually that whole idea of traditional media, which is what we call earned media, that's where sort of this I'm going to put out a press release thing is earned media versus shared media. So shared media is social media. That's the big one that everyone thinks of. Owned media, this is a newer one in terms of the power that it can influence over things like public opinion, or by putting pressure on, or in fact getting earned media in the end. Those are things like if you are a researcher and you're affiliated with a health authority, a hospital, a research institute, they likely have their own website. And on their website, they likely have web stories. They also likely have newsletters that might go out to subscribers. So these are things that are owned. So that means they're owned by the organization. You have full control over what's written in there. And then paid, back in the day, it would be sort of the advertising people would deal with paid media. But nowadays, you think of boosted social media content. That's a big one. So all the lines are very blurry. And so this sort of like desire to get a story in the news media, really, you need to start thinking about it differently. If you're trying to reach a certain audience, there are many, many ways to reach it. And the earned media is not the same as it used to be. Next slide. I think it's back to you,
So
Heather.
let's talk a little bit about how the newsroom works. So if we go behind the scenes, one, can I just say that journalists are not our enemy, and they're not actually out to get us, and that you can have really positive, long-term, great working relationships with journalists. They work insanely hard, and the pressures are higher than ever to produce more, work longer hours. And it's their job to tell a balanced story. So we bring a perspective. They may also seek out other perspectives when they're telling a story. They oftentimes need to deliver new stories every day. So they truly welcome hearing great, good, thought out story ideas. When you look inside the newsroom where Elaine has worked, it's a 24-hour news cycle. There is constantly news happening. A journalist may be assigned a story in the morning. They may also have to go out that day and find their own in time for it to air at 6 o'clock, or in time for it to be in the paper the next day. And so they're looking for people to interview. They're looking for stories to tell. They're looking for the visuals. If it's TV, if it's print, like, what does this look like, right? There are deadlines every day. They vary by the media platform. And then sometimes you succeed in getting your story and getting your interview, and a plane lands in a farmer's field, and that takes over the news for the day, and your story gets bumped, and maybe it makes it the next day, and maybe it doesn't.
That happens. You know what? It does happen. I think most media outlets try really hard to use the material that they have spent resources gathering, but it does happen. So I think the next big question then, of course, is what makes a good news story? So one of the keys here is that for all of the researchers, scientists in the room, you have institutions that you belong to. And all of those places, whether it's universities, research institutes, or hospitals, have communications teams, and they are there to help you with this part of it. If we go to the next slide. So if you think about the stories that capture your attention when you're flipping through social media or when you're looking online, what are the stories that are interesting to you? Well, first of all, location matters. So depending on where you are, being sort of the local celebrity or star or expert helps, but also, is this national? Is this tied to something that's happening currently that's really topical? So of course, during COVID, anything related to COVID was really, really interesting. Right now, they're talking about this walking pneumonia thing. So if you have some research related to that, that's also going to be more likely to get media attention. Is it new? Is it unique? Is it groundbreaking? Does it have a huge impact on the world potentially, or patients, or on a really difficult to solve problem? Is there some sort of pressing timeline here that you really need to deal with? And also conflict. We know that conflict is a really big news story, and people love hearing about conflicts. In the case of research, it could be you found something interesting that actually conflicts with previous information. So there's that tension there. And also remember, again, we go back to this idea that it doesn't have to be a 6 p.m. news story on the television. It could be your organization's blog or website or a newsletter article that goes out. It can be posted on social media. So there are many, many different ways to get your story out. So go to the next slide, please. So again, going back to this idea that you have many organizations that you belong to, many academic affiliations, many people connected with your research. So you need to reach out to them, or you need to make sure that the communications person that you're working with knows this and can reach out to all of those different organizations. So it often takes, when there's a big research paper that involves many, many people, it often takes many, many different communications people talking together. So I used to work at the Children's Hospital Research Institute. Often we'd be working with the folks at UBC, sometimes at SFU as well as sort of the local health authorities. So really you need to engage with them, and that is exactly what they're there for. And then they can help you walk through, you know, which person is going to do what, who's going to be the main person to send out the story, what is it that you're trying to say here, what are your core key messages, and we'll get to the really fun stuff on key messages shortly. So I want to give you some examples of things that have made headlines, as you can see. So world's first, you know, that's obviously a big seller. You can say this is the world's first, a Canadian first, the first time at your hospital, the first time in your province. Those are always really, really fantastic ways to get media attention. Something really novel and interesting, we call it the water cooler conversation. If you could see people talking about this the next day in the office, I guess if they're going to the office these days, you know, like pig organs, that's always very, very sexy, because people are always thinking this is like science fiction coming to life. And of course, like I mentioned, COVID. So if you look at the stories, though, at the end of the day, I can have the next slide, please. It really needs to be about people. The patients. Who are you trying to help? Who are you trying to save? Or who are you trying, like, whose life are you trying to improve here with your work and research? And that is a fundamental question, to turn your research into the so what. It's why is this interesting? Why would anyone care? You need to show why this is relevant to people. Next slide. So I want to give you an example of a research paper that came out when I was at the Children's Hospital Research Institute here. So here's the paper. I mean, it's just really like, yeah, I know there's scientists in the room, so maybe you would be able to look at this and be like, oh my God, this is so amazing. But from the average person, it's just, wow, what is that? I have no idea what this means. Okay, so from here, the lead researcher on this is an amazing partner with communications. He really gets it. And he really understands what research will make good stories. So from there, we turn that crazy research paper headline, which is, we could do a whole session about those titles you guys put on your projects. This is what it came out as: 1 in 7 billion, first in the world diagnosis, a result of incredible teamwork. So you see what a difference in the way that we've sold the story. And it's the same research, but this is the takeaway. So when we start thinking about key messages, you know, this is a key message. So the story that you see on the back, that's actually the web story that I wrote for the Children's Hospital Research Institute website. From there, of course, we had social media, and then we actually used the web story to pitch out to media. So no more press releases. Press releases, depending on the situation, may not be the most effective way to do things anymore. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see some of the coverage that we were able to get. And you know, the great thing is when you create a web story, it is exactly the way that you want it to be. You know, the researcher and the research team gets to check it over. They get to make sure that you have it 100% accurate before it goes out there. So when the reporters are using that as their base, then they have a much higher chance of making sure that their content is accurate. And sometimes they'll actually just reprint the web story as it is. So we were very lucky. We got great coverage. You know, the other interesting thing you'll see is that the Sun, you know, the Vancouver Sun, which is obviously one of the big papers here in Vancouver, they will shoot videos now. So they also actually put together a little video story along with the print story. So it's very different than the way that it used to be, even, let's say, 10 years ago.
Okay, so now we're talking about collaborating, right? We've got the incredible research, and then we're trying to translate this into something that we're actually going to share now into a public sphere. And so think about working with your comms team months before the publication date. And we're going to help you figure out what is some plain language headline, what is the grabbing, patient impacting piece. We can work together to figure out What are the visuals? Who is the patient who can be interviewed to really highlight and bring the story to life, right? What are the key messages? And by what are the key messages, and we will talk more about this, we're not here to control what you say. So when someone says, let's talk about the key messages, it's not comms coming to tell you like you have to work within this and you can only say this. You have, as the researcher, a massive amount of knowledge. Like I can't even, the hands aren't long enough, arms aren't long enough to talk about how much knowledge you have. And so having a message, having a conversation about key messages is about figuring out what are the most important points that you want someone to remember. So out of everything you know, and this research tells us, what is it that you want to get across? And what are the visuals? Sometimes we put together a really great pitch for earned media and they don't get back to us. And this happens all the time. So don't take it to heart. Don't think that your relationship with this journalist is doomed forever and you'll never pitch them again. Don't think that you suck. None of this is true. Instead, maybe it's now a great web story. Maybe it's a great social media post. Maybe it goes in the newsletter. But pitch that same journalist again. Don't be disheartened. Maybe take this story idea you have, and if it didn't land with this journalist, shop it around to some other journalist, because you never know. So let's talk about what happens when a media request comes in. So we know what this is like. Your comms team calls. It's 11 o'clock. We've just gotten a request from CBC. They would like to interview you by 1. You go, what? It's not the comms team doing this to you. This is just generally, like, this is actually how the newsroom works. And so it's quite normal to get a request like this. And ideally, at your institution, there is a process that is well known and understood and that works really well. And so if the journalist has called you directly, probably the process is that you get in touch with your comms team right away and they can support you through this, and that your media relations person is going to talk to the journalist about, the deadline in the outlet and what format. Is this for TV? Is this for print? What are we doing? Do you need some visuals? Can I connect you with a patient? We're going to figure out the deadlines and all of it and work with you to make it as good as possible. And then you've got some considerations, because we've collected all of this information about the purpose of the interview and what they want to cover and where it's going to air. And, sometimes you get a sense that there's already sort of a bit of an angle that they're curious to take with this story. And so discuss with your comms team, discuss with your other partners on the research. Is this an interview that we want to do? Because these things take a lot of time. And so how does this, and remember we talked about the goals and the target audiences and who we're trying to reach. And so strategically, does this accomplish what it is that we're trying to accomplish? Are we advancing our advocacy in some way if we do this? Is this going to effectively put some pressure on some policymakers, on some legislators to move some things forward that we know is essential to move forward? If they're calling you, it probably is because you're the expert on this topic. But if you're not, if they've called you and you're not the expert, it's a great piece of your relationship with the journalist to say, not necessarily me, but I'm going to recommend so-and-so because they're actually the expert. And I suggest that you call them and they will be amazing. Here's like a warm handoff and I'm going to introduce you. Sometimes you get a request to participate in a story. And for whatever reason, it's actually a topic from which you would like to distance yourself, your institution. For whatever reason, it's just not something that you want to be a part of. And it's always okay to simply say no. We don't have to say yes to every media request that we get. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about key messages, questions, and answers. And we're going to break this into 2 parts. So we're going to talk a little bit about organizational spokespeople or, the clinicians, the investigators, your official spokesperson role, and then separately the PFD storytelling and participation piece, because they are unique and both really important. So we wanted to address both. So when we think about key messages, and I was mentioning this earlier, you know so much. And so of all of that knowledge, the key messages are the 3 or 4 brief, concise, most important points that you want the audience to remember. And if we're talking about media, the media is not your target audience. You're talking through the media to your target audience. And so what is it that you want them to know? Another way to think about key messages is like your elevator speech, right? So if you had 30 seconds in an elevator with like a policymaker, with a legislator, what would you want them to get off that elevator knowing from you? Key messages are those 3 or 4 brief, most important points that you are proactively trying to weave in. And not just to the first interview, but say you're having an incredible day and 4 or 5 media outlets are interested. Maybe it's even gone international. Say those key messages at every interview. Something that we see is that our spokesperson says the key messages at the first interview and then thinks they need to say something different at the next interview, but you don't. It's a different audience. It's a different media outlet. Those key messages are there to be used over and over and over because repetition is also how we actually get the message through. So again, and I can't say this enough, 3 or 4 points. It's not 17 pages of bullet points. Those are not key messages.
You know who's really good at doing key messages? Politicians. So if you ever have an opportunity, if you're watching traditional television and you're watching a live interview, you know what they call them, scrums, when they're all standing around, all the reporters are standing around sort of like bombarding a politician with questions. Listen to how they respond. You will find that no matter what the question actually is, the politician will often say exactly the same thing or sort of variations on a theme over and over and over again. And, you know, they're the masters of it because they know exactly what message it is they want to get across. They have it down cold, and that's what they say, regardless of the question. So a good opportunity for you to practice and to listen is to watch one of those scrums next time you're in Ottawa. So, or if you're in Ottawa and you're ever sort of hanging out, then definitely see if you can listen in on a politician responding, because really at the end of the day, you know, your key messages should be those messages that you remember and that you're repeating yourself. This is a different situation. It's not a politician interview, so it's not going to be aggressive like that. But you should still take that into mind is, okay, what are the things I really want this person to know at the end? If someone's reading this story in the newspaper, what do I want them to walk away with? So think of it as sort of this idea of, okay, what is the main message? So your impactful introduction. So the one line, can you summarize your years of research into one line and really just capture what it is that you've been trying to do or what you found? Then you can go from there and look at the actual main discoveries, the results of your research. What is the impact for people? How are you helping them? How are you changing their treatment options? How are you making their lives better? You can use stats here, but not too many stats. You can use specific examples. And then the other idea that you really should think about when you're formulating key messages is the call to action. What is it that you actually want people to take away from this to do to you know, transform the way things are currently? From the current state, what is it that you want to get across? So I wanted to give you another example of a research project or a research paper that we worked with at the Research Institute. And this one was actually interesting because it was not actually the researcher who reached out to us to say, oh, hey, I've got this interesting study. We actually were only notified about this study because a reporter called and asked to interview the lead researcher. So this is, again, a really great example of why you need to reach out to your comms team as early as possible before publication, because then we were scrambling. So the study itself, life-threatening cardiac arrhythmia and sudden death during electronic gaming, international case series and systematic review. Okay, fine. But really what this is you look on the left, video games can trigger deadly heart rhythms in at-risk kids. Now, come on, that is a great story. And it doesn't really matter that the researcher, it was funny because the lead researcher, Dr. Sanatani, he was kind of like, well, yeah, I could see why it's interesting, but it's a really small study. There were only like, X number of kids. But it just, the takeaway from it is so compelling. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see these are some of the stories that came out of it. And a headline is a really great identification of what the journalist thought was the key message. And here you have a couple of examples, right? It's this idea that kids could die while playing video games. So now if you go to the next slide, you'll see that I've actually broken this down for you. So here are key messages that, and this is not black and white. If you were the lead researcher, you might have a slightly different interpretation, but you would work with your comms team to come up with the main messages. Number one, video games can trigger deadly heart rhythms in at-risk kids. Number two, researchers identified 22 cases of children who suddenly lost consciousness while playing video games. Now, out of the paper itself, there were two things that I thought were extremely interesting. 6 children were resuscitated out of those 22, but 4 children died. And the other point, multiplayer war games were the most frequent trigger. And you can tell from the questions that the reporters asked that they also thought that these were the most interesting things because they were mentioned in all of the media stories that we got. And the call to action. And, again, this is the wrap up. These findings apply only to kids with inherited heart rhythm disorders, about 2,000 children. So if you think of this, it's a very small select group of kids. But at the end of the day, it's the research itself about the fact that some kids could die while playing video games, or some kids have died. That is what is the most interesting thing to come out of it. And I know when I talk to researchers, sometimes they feel uncomfortable or they don't like this idea that maybe what they think is the most interesting part of their research or the most salient point or the most relevant is not necessarily what the reporter decides is the most interesting, but it's balancing that sort of, and I don't want to use the word sensationalizing because this is the truth. Some kids have died while playing video games, but balancing that with the message you're trying to get across, which is that, we need to study this more. And parents who have kids who have had unusual episodes while playing video games need to investigate further with the medical team. So it's a little bit of getting that media interest, public interest, and also getting your message across. So I want to share with you an example of a practice interview that this is a former colleague of mine from Global News, and he was working at the Union Gospel Mission as their communications person. So we did some media training together, and I want you to listen really carefully to the answer to his question here. Let me play the video. I know it's a big deal for the UGM. Tell us about the Thanksgiving meal.
Our Thanksgiving meal is on Thanksgiving Monday. We're serving about 3,000 meals, and it's a proper Thanksgiving meal of turkey, mashed potatoes, and 600 pies.
Okay, it's pretty standard, typical answer. So now, if you go to the next slide, we did the question again. And this time I want you to listen for those key messages, because I'm going to ask you afterwards, I'm going to ask people to put up their hand or come to the mic or put it in the chat. What key messages did you hear? You've got the big Thanksgiving meal coming up in a few weeks. Tell me about it.
The meal is all about saving and changing lives. There are thousands of people on the street who feel forgotten. They feel like they don't have anything to be thankful for this Thanksgiving. And we're going to counter that. We're going to show them that we're here, that we care, and that we will provide a pathway off the streets, out of their circumstances, and fill it with hope. That's what it's about. This meal will actually be the start of a miracle in the lives of some of our guests.
Okay, so you hear that same question, very different answers. So what did you guys hear as key messages? I'm not sure what the setup is in the room there, Heather, if people can come up and answer, or if people who are online want to pop it in the chat.
Yeah, so obviously in the second iteration of this, there was the message came out, right? Like in the first one, it was about, okay, what was the turkey dinner? But I think I missed, like it almost felt like the second question was different than the first question, right? Like the first question was like, what's involved in the dinner. I mean, maybe we can go back and look at it, but yeah, definitely the second version was, it was exactly what he wanted to advocate for. It was almost like he had a plan for what he wanted to say, right? And that came out.
Remember, the question is not important. So it actually doesn't really matter exactly what the question is.
This
Okay.
is what I want to bring out. And I got to make sure I say it.
Exactly. So the question was sort of generally, tell me about this Thanksgiving dinner, right? And you could answer it the first way, where it's like there were, you know, and I've done this story myself as a reporter a gazillion times. Every Thanksgiving, we'd go to the Union Gospel Mission and do the turkey story. And we'd always get we cooked 300 turkeys and, you know, 600 pies and 1,000 pounds of potatoes. But the second answer there is really what the message is. This is about hope. You know, this is about hope. We're saving people's lives, because that's really what the Thanksgiving dinner is about. On a practical level, yes, it's about serving turkey and mashed potatoes with gravy. But the actual key message here, we're offering this so we can save people's lives. So I see Julia popped in the chat, celebration challenges. Maybe Julia, I don't know if you want to come on and elaborate by what you mean. Or it's okay, you don't have to. You can type in the chat if you have anything further to add. But anyhow, this is an example of the difference that a powerful key message can make, because what's more memorable is going to be that idea of saving lives, right? The stats can be whatever the stats are, but really it's about saving lives. And that is what you want people to know when they finish watching the story. Oh my gosh, they're saving people's lives. They're making a difference. They're giving them hope.
So we prepare our key messages, and our key messages are those, again, 3 to 4 concise points that we want people to remember. And that's what we are proactively weaving into our answers as much as possible and every time. Also, we know that we need to be prepared for the typical questions that we're probably going to be asked in an interview, right? The who, what, when, where, why. And if you're announcing research, they're probably going to ask about whose lives are impacted. What is the improvement or change in a person's life, right? What did you determine? And also consider that the journalist is always thinking about what their viewer or their listener or their reader is interested in, right? And so, as Elaine mentioned, with the video game research, she could hear the pattern in the questions that were being asked and what it was that the journalists were latching onto, right? They're thinking about their audience, because the media is not our target audience. We're communicating through them to their reader, to their listener, etc. So in asking us the questions that their viewers, readers are interested in, they may play a little devil's advocate, right? They may challenge a little bit. And I suggest we welcome this. So if they're asking you something that is bringing up misinformation or misconceptions, embrace this chance to do myth busting, right? Embrace this chance to say, I'm so glad you asked that, because there's a lot of people who think that that's the case. But in fact, just because you're an organ donor doesn't at all mean that the team will try any less hard to save your life. In fact, these are the processes, this is how we do things, right? So welcome those chances to deal with misinformation or rumors. If there's something controversial, right? I love that moment. And so never think of it like, oh, the journalist was out to get me. Like, they asked me that thing. Like, that's not true. That's super irrelevant. That's a myth. I don't know why they brought that up. No, please celebrate the chance to answer that question and change the conversation. And keep in mind that even though we have these questions and answers and we're really well prepared, that our key messages are proactively what we are trying to get in there and what it is that we want to see in that published, edited, final story. All right, we thought a lot about you guys as we wrote these next slides. Plain language. How many of you speak to clinicians, fellow clinicians and investigators, and also patients? Show of hands. Yeah. And you speak completely differently, right, to each audience. And so when we're communicating, if you're at a scientific conference, you might use all of your scientific explanations and get really excited about the methodology and all of that stuff. That's like really, really cool. When we're communicating through the media, we're thinking about the listener and what they're going to understand and how to speak with them. If you write out your speaking notes first, if you write out a plain language summary of your research, there's this terrific tool, hemingwayapp.com. You can copy and paste your text in there, and it will tell you the reading grade level. And it is a tremendously helpful tool. You can paste your text in there and then edit within Hemingway and see if you can watch that grade level drop lower and lower and lower.
So, you know, as a reporter, I obviously did not have science background training. I mean, I learned a lot on the job really quickly, but you know, there were words that always just, to me, I was like, I think this is what they mean. And they are words we hear all the time. And I think when you're in the field, you just forget that people actually may not actually understand what you're referring to. So acute care, that's one of those ones that it took me a while as a reporter, as a member of the public, to understand, oh, okay. So they're talking about like really sick people. Ambulatory care, that's another one. Because you think ambulatory, you're thinking ambulances. Ambulatory care does not, to me, equate like a situation where you're walking to an appointment, or like you're able to be ambulatory and actually go to some appointment during the day at a hospital. That to me did not make sense. My other favorite one is comorbidity. Because, you know, when I hear the word morbidity as a member of the public, I think dead. I do not think, oh, maybe you have diabetes in addition to high blood pressure. That is not what I think of at all. Adverse events, control, machine learning. Oh, machine learning, that's like a relatively new one that I just, every time I hear machine learning, I'm just, wow. I don't know exactly what that means. It's something to do with all this like computer stuff. Again, and I actually live in this world of science and research to some extent as a communications person. Assay. I know you lab people really love assays, but you know, can you not just say lab test? So the other thing that I mentioned earlier was that whole idea of numbers, especially if you're doing an interview for television or radio, numbers get really confusing. You just think about if you're sitting there listening and somebody starts spieling off a lot of numbers. If you're trying to do it for impact, that's one thing. But if you actually are trying to use numbers that you're hoping people will understand, you need to translate them to something that actually they can relate to as they're listening. So this is where analogies come in really, really handily. Things like the site for the new St. Paul's Hospital is 2.5 times bigger than the current location. Station Street is the size of 15 football fields. Like, give them context and actually give them something they can relate to. When we talk about a disease affecting 20,000 people, find a city in your province that's the equivalent and say that would be like everyone in Squamish having this disease. So, you know, from there, we go a little bit further into this idea that in research and science, a lot of words that we use are very different to the public. So often you hear of results in research, you know, enhance, positive trend, theory, bias, anomaly. Your definition of what enhance, like these are all things that sound like enhance and positive trend sound like they should be good things, right? It's like, oh, well, you enhance something, that usually means you've improved it somehow. But in research, that's not necessarily the case. It just means you have more of whatever it is you were looking at. There's more, it's higher. That doesn't necessarily mean it's good though. Theory, a scientific theory is different than what a layperson's understanding of theory might be. Bias, same thing. You know, you look at these words and you realize if you're using them in everyday conversation or with media, people might not actually understand what it is you're trying to say. Is whatever you found more of, is that a good thing or is that a bad thing? Or you're not sure? Well, then say that. Don't say that we found that there was a positive trend in the number of people who were getting whatever because of whatever. It's like, is this a good thing or is this a bad thing? Or you're still not sure if it's good or bad. So, I mean, I love this little illustration. Everyone on my floor is coding. Very different interpretation if you're a computer person versus if you're a doctor. So just remember that everyone on my floor is coding when you're thinking about what you want to say and how you're going to say it.
So let's shift gears from the clinician, the investigator being interviewed to a PFD. Because this is a completely different approach. And a space that I work in continuously, whether it's the clients of a supervised injection site or a transgender health clinic, or fellow patients in the transplant world, we're putting their safety and comfort first. We're consciously not tokenizing someone. We're consciously not putting someone's trauma on display. We're making sure that they're at a place of readiness to talk about this experience. We're maybe inviting someone to participate. And if they hesitate, we put their safety and comfort always before, well, we need to get someone for this interview, because that's actually not the most important thing, right? We have a really fulsome, informed consent conversation, right? So as you think about telling your story, are you comfortable with the fact that this could be seen by anyone, anywhere? That once it's posted online, you could have a hard time getting it taken down. If someone searches your full name, they may find this story. And will this story and it living out there, and as people come up to you and want to talk to you because they saw you on the news, they send you a DM, is it going to impact your mental health? Are you going to feel safe? Is this going to bring up things for you that are not comfortable? And so more about, setting a PFD up for success, right? So think about also, we have conversations with the patient, with the client about if someone's quite accustomed to being in environments where the clinician, the doctor asks them questions and they must answer all those questions as part of their medical care to receive services, they may carry that into a media interview. And so we have a good conversation in advance about the power dynamic. As the patient, you don't actually need to answer everything that is asked of you. A journalist, not ill-intentioned in any way, shape, or form, right? But out from a place of genuine curiosity, may ask questions that you're not comfortable answering, or you're just not at a place where you're comfortable answering. And that's okay to just say, I'm not comfortable with this. Also, working with your comms team. So my role in this case is often to say to the journalist ahead of time, the patient and I have had a conversation. They're super excited to speak with you. What they're going to share with you is really relevant and impactful. They're going to share their story, but they've said a few things out of bounds. And so please don't ask them about this or this or this. That is always respected. Always. I've never had a journalist cross those lines. They want the interview to be as successful as you do. You really are on the same page, right? They're not looking to upset anybody. They do want to tell a good story. There are different approaches to whether that patient or client, donor family wants the media contact to be present with them or not. Sometimes it's simply not possible. Sometimes it is possible and it's helpful and it makes you more comfortable. So I've seen both. Elaine and I talked a lot about this. We've seen both. And so, but it is something that if you would be more comfortable as the PFD having someone with you, then it is often something that could be explored to see what's possible. The PFD is not asked to deliver key messages. They are not the official spokesperson. They are not the researcher. They cannot talk to you about the methodology. But when it comes to research, you've chosen this patient partner. This patient partner is being put forward for interview because they have a really relevant lived experience that they can speak to that brings the impact of this research to life, right? So here are the findings, blah, 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 blah. And then here's a patient who says, this is transformative for me. you know, I thought my life expectancy was this, and now actually it's this. Or I can take one less medication because of this, or I can take less of a medication because of this. And this is how this is making things better for me. And the reality is, we remember people's stories long after we have forgotten the statistics. But just like official spokespeople, like so the researcher, the clinician, a PFD does take time in advance, often with the media person, to think about how it is that you want to tell your story and link it to the research. Because rarely do you have enough time in a media interview. If you think about a typical live CBC radio sort of drive home show interview is somewhere in the realm of 7 minutes. And some of that 7 minutes is taken up with the intro and the extra and the host actually asking the questions. Maybe they've got 2 of you on the show. Maybe it's the PFD and the researcher. So you have 2 minutes worth of airtime, maybe. You will not be able to tell your patient or donor or family story from start to finish. So you're choosing deliberately some anecdotes, some highlights you want to share. Maybe it's a high point and it's a low point. Maybe it's how this research is changing your life in this really concrete way. So you choose these highlights in advance that you're thinking about sharing.
Okay, so now you're actually doing the interview. So hopefully you put in a lot of thought based on your key messages. If you're the PFD, thinking of what you want to say, what are your little highlights? And, you know, I think the key is thinking of the audience. So if you're doing this interview in relation to research, then tie your experience into the research somehow. So if we wrap it sort of all together for the actual interview itself, think of the interview and the interviewee, the reporter, as somebody who's trying to have a conversation with you. So let it be natural as it can be. TV interviews are obviously very unnatural. I know a lot of people get very, very uncomfortable, but try to think of this as dinner party conversation, or somebody was like, hey, what is it that you're working on? Tell me about this. This is really interesting. Well, how about that? How about that? So you're not trying to give your whole spiel right away. Let it flow. Usually at the end, in these kinds of interviews, often the reporter will ask, you know, is there anything that I missed? Is there anything that you want to add? Or if they don't, you can also say, you know what, there's one thing that we didn't talk about is this. So don't feel like you need to shove it all in there in the first 2 questions. And don't let the answers keep going and going and going and going and going. Answer their question. You don't need to keep elaborating with additional material, because the reporter should be listening and will ask follow-up questions from there. And as Heather already mentioned, you know, if you're doing several interviews in one day, you may be feeling really tired, and your answers may be getting shorter and shorter. You may be sort of, you know, trying to summarize even faster, and you may be losing that energy, but it should be, you should think of it as fresh every single time, and that every single interview is a completely brand new audience and a brand new outlet. The other thing, you know, what we like to tell people, especially if you are doing an interview that's more controversial, in this case, most of you will hopefully never have to do one of those, but watch what you say at all times, even when it's not the actual official interview. The reporter is listening. I've often heard really interesting things before and after the official interview, or even other potential story ideas, but you can also think of that as an opportunity. You know, if there's something else that you're working on that's really interesting, maybe talk about that, you know, rather than something that might not be related or that could be misconstrued. So just be careful when you are with a reporter at all times, that you're saying things that you would be okay if they repeat it in some form. Instead of using we, talk about your actual institution or hospital. You know, here at the BC Children's Hospital Research Institute, we have developed the brand new method for testing out genetic material. So, because when you say we, no one actually knows what that is. Remember, they're taking little snippets, especially if it's radio or television, and out of context, your sentence might not make sense. They're only going to use maybe 10 seconds in television. In radio, it might be less if it's for a news, the actual news part. If it's for a longer interview, you might get a little tiny bit more. But remember, like, think of it as 10 seconds. They're going to cut out a 10-second chunk. So say what you need to say and make it all fit within that 10 seconds. And then, of course, if they do ask the same question over and over again, which reporters often do, don't respond with a, okay, look, like, I've already told you this. And as I just said, you know, well, if you were listening, this is what I said. They're asking questions because they didn't understand what you said. You didn't explain it clearly enough the first time. Maybe there was something in there that they just were confused by. So what it is, when they ask you the same thing over and over again, it means that they didn't actually understand what you said. So that's a signal to you to maybe work on those key messages a little bit more. So then when you move on to the part where they are asking you things potentially that might be controversial, or they might be throwing in just sort of red herring questions to see if they get anything interesting. Again, when I talk about the politicians, they don't answer the questions that they're asked. You answer the answer that you want to give. So you're the one in control that way, because the reporter can ask whatever questions they want. They could be off topic. They could be trying to lead you into something, especially around COVID times. A lot of researchers are doing a lot of great work around COVID, but reporters would often take that as an opportunity to just ask them general questions about COVID, especially if they were clinicians. So if you did research about the vaccine and you happen to be, you know, an ICU doctor or an infectious disease doctor, they would probably try to ask you, well, how bad is it in the hospital now? How many cases do you have? Are the hospital wards overflowing? Because they know that you actually know the answer. But you don't have to answer those questions. You could say, well, I'm here today to talk about, that's a really great question. But today we're speaking about this research, which I think is going to be really important for people who want to get a vaccine. So you have some examples there at the bottom of things that you can say to steer it back to what you want to say. This is a common concern. Let's look at this from the broader perspective. At the end of the day, it's really important for people to get their COVID vaccine. So again, you can see, like, so yes, you know, you are correct. The hospitals are whatever it is. You may have heard that it's really busy in the hospitals, but the message that we really want to get across to people today is that it's really important for them to get their vaccines, right? That's an important aspect. But what Canadians really need to know is that they need to get their vaccines. So you can have the reporter ask you whatever they want, but you just, if you stick to your key messages, you will never stray away from what you want to say, and you will never stray into territory that you don't want to get into. So, of course, the whole idea of the ums, the pause, the fillers, like, and we all do it. Everyone does it. Next time someone's talking to you, though, listen to them and actually, like, mark down how many times they do it. This is an exercise they do in Toastmasters, apparently, is that they will ask people to start making note of when other people they're talking to make all of these sort of filler noises and filler comments. The best thing to do is, if you're not sure what to say, is just silence. It may feel like a very long time where you're not saying anything or you're thinking about it, but it's actually very, very short. And also remember, if this is a taped interview, they're going to be editing it. So if the reporter asks you a question and you have to just stop for a moment and think, how am I going to answer that? That's okay. They'll wait for you. If you do a lot of stumbling and mumbling, you guys have heard it all in other people that you've listened to in interviews. It's really distracting. And actually, sometimes you just end up focusing on that rather than what they're saying. So you can start today by working on getting rid of these filler sounds.
Okay, quick drinking game.
Okay.
JT is up. Whenever the Prime Minister speaks and goes either or ah, take a shot.
Okay. Oh. That's it.
I almost drowned that time.
So you see, everybody does it. So just to go briefly over what actually happens during a television interview. So these are not usually live. You will know if it's live. If they want you on their morning show or their noon show or a talk show, then obviously that's going to be live. Generally speaking, when you get a TV media request, it's going to be taped. So they're going to come and shoot it, and then they will edit it. Like I said, at the end of the day, remember, it's going to be these little tiny snippets that they take. So with the taped interview, the beauty of it is that you can actually say your answers over again. If you didn't like what you said, you can actually just say, hey, hang on, you know what? I want to do that again. And I've had this happen to me many, many times, and it's never an issue. The reporter will be happy to have you do it again, because they will also want to get the right answer and a good answer. So you can definitely stop, redo it, even in the middle of what you're saying. If you realize, wait, I'm losing the plot here and this is getting really confusing, you can just say, hang on, let's stop and do that again. That's not a big deal. Obviously, you cannot do that with a live interview. So listen to what the reporter is telling you in terms of, where to stand. The camera person will do all of that. The other important thing is, don't wear all white, don't wear all black, don't wear stripes. Stripes do really weird things. If you're going into studio, do not wear green, because that's what they actually use for the green screen. The other thing that I get asked all the time is to, where do they look? Where should I look? So even if there's not an actual reporter standing there, and if it's just a camera person doing the interview, do not look right into the camera. You have to look either at the reporter if the reporter's there, or look at the camera person, who should be standing off to the side of the camera. Radio interviews, same thing. They could be live, they could be taped. Some news outlets, more specifically the CBC, they like to do pre-interviews. So this is when they'll want to talk to you and chat with you. One of the producers or writers will call you and ask you a whole bunch of questions, so they know what you're going to say before you go live on their show. And so this will also give you a good idea of what they want to ask you. And you can also tell them, like, these are the important things, and this is what I really want to talk about. So this is not going to be recorded for broadcast. It's just an opportunity for them to really understand what it is that you're going to be talking about. And then during the actual interview, listen really, really carefully, because you can hear when the host needs to cut this interview short, or the time is wrapping up, or if they really want to ask a question. And I think if you listen to CBC radio, you will also hear this. You can tell, you're like, okay, I know this interview needs to wrap up, because I can hear, you can almost hear that sort of that energy through the radio waves when the host is trying to get in there and needs to cut it off, because it's almost at the top of the hour and it's time for the news. And you can have your notes. Everyone should have notes. It's actually really helpful to write out what you want to say, because by writing it out, it reinforces it. But try not to read off of your paper, because it's really unnatural and it sounds kind of stilted. And same thing, if you listen carefully to different interviews on the radio, you can actually tell when somebody's sort of reading stats or reading something, or when they're actually having a natural conversation. And so nowadays, obviously, a lot of people are doing things by Zoom. Look at where I am today. Tons of times these days, you can actually get away with doing a Zoom interview, which makes it a lot more convenient for you and also for the reporter. So when you're doing a Zoom interview, though, you do have to consider how you're looking, what your background looks like, whether the lighting is good. The worst thing is when people are on their laptops. And you know how your laptop is usually like down, so then you end up like kind of like looking like down like this at the thing. I'm on a desktop, so I can't really imitate it, but you all know what I mean. You end up having this weird like sort of face pointing down at the laptop. That is not good. Just very simple. Get a few big books and prop up your laptop so that the camera is eye level, so that you're looking right into the screen. The lighting is really important. You don't want to have bright windows behind you. Also watch if there's really bright sunlight coming in on your face. The best thing is to have your face facing the window, or you can get a little light. It doesn't have to be one of those ring lights. It can actually be any light, any little lamp that you can sort of point in a certain direction. IKEA has them for like $15. So also check out the background. How much junk do you have in the background? If you have a whole bunch of stuff, try to pick a corner where you can't see that. You can put the blur background on, but sometimes, it looks fake. Or when you use the fake backgrounds, do not use a fake background, because again, they look fake.
So after you've done this, terrific interview where you've nailed all your key messages, dodged awkward questions. Oh dear. There is an editing process. As Elaine mentioned earlier, that interview that was taped, you may be edited down to just a few lines, just a few seconds, right? So you've done the interview, you tell all of your friends and family, you post on their socials, I'm going to be on the news, turn into CTV at whatever time. And then your face shows up and then your voice is there for 7 seconds and then it's gone. And you go, oh, that was it. And that's normal. Also, may I choose this as a moment to remind you that hopefully you used your key messages and hopefully that 2 sentences that they used from you is what you wanted them to use, right? It was one of the actual points that you're trying to make. This question comes up a lot where you do the interview and then you know that a journalist is going to go back and either edit or do some sort of writing for print. And people ask, well, I get to approve the final story, right? You do not. In fact, it's against the journalistic code of ethics to let you try to influence and get into that final piece. They may circle back to you if they want to double check a statistic or something that you said. They want to confirm their understanding. I mean, I know you spoke in super plain language and nothing will be confusing, but maybe they want to come back to you and double check something, okay? But no, they won't send you the whole article. They may, if we're accustomed to telling a story, and I'm going to speak a little bit to the PFDs right now, we are accustomed to telling our story a particular way. I mean, we've all told our story probably thousands of times, and there's a way that we're used to saying it and hearing it. A journalist may tell it differently. They may choose different highlights. They may choose different pieces. And that doesn't make it wrong. It doesn't mean that they told your story out of context. It just means that they told it, they heard it, and they told it differently than you might or do. And we ask for corrections pretty sparingly. If it's already aired on TV or radio, there's not a lot of point in actually asking for a correction anyway. If it's an online story where, yeah, you could get an edit to the digital version, then sure, but only if there was an actual mistake. If you didn't love how they phrased it, or you didn't love which sentence they chose to quote you on, think about that for your next interview and what you would choose to say and what key messages you would choose to use. I'm a massive fan of saying thank you to journalists because they work super hard, because you're trying to build these ongoing relationships where they know if I contact this institute, their comms person gets back to me quickly, delivers good spokespeople, communicates, right? And so you are relationship building. And I actually really believe in genuinely saying, you know what, this was a really sensitive topic. I know that this patient was having, you know, this is a hard story for them to tell. I really appreciate how thoughtful you were in asking these questions, right? On the left is my absolute favorite correction ever, because it's just so freaking weird. And the original style article about Guantanamo didn't actually get that much, like it, right. See, now you're with me. So you know, it's a story that ran, but it's the correction that was heard around the world because the person who was featured didn't like being described as thick-set. So he chose to write into the paper to say, no, I am muscular and I require a correction. And this correction ran worldwide. So I hope he is really happy with how that story turned out. He's still working out. Yeah, you can all Google him if you, I know you all are right now. Dr. Captain Robert Durand. Can I just say something that Elaine really made me think of around, because I see that we're okay on time here. She said, make the most use of your time with the journalist. And sometimes you have the opportunity to pitch them while you have them, right? So they're telling a story with you, and then you say, Well, since you're here, can I just plant a couple seeds? I just want to tell you about this, this, and this. And so true story related to this conference from last year. I was sitting next to Shilpa at the banquet, and Shilpa and I were talking, and she was sharing something that she is experiencing and working towards, and something that's really big for her, that's really critical. And I'm not going to give away what it is. And I said to her, and she was thinking about like going quite public with it. And I said, do I have your permission if the opportunity arises to pitch that to media? Are you comfortable with that? Is that okay with you? Like, let me know, later if you want to think about it. She said, no, I have to go really public with this to make this happen. So yes, you have my permission. So actually sitting next to her that night, I DM'd Andre Picard, who didn't write back. And then 6 months later, Dr. Brian Goldman from White Coat, Black Art, right, the national CBC radio show, was at one of my client sites, Community Health Center. So he did the stuff there that he was doing. That episode has aired. And then I had 3 minutes with him on the sidewalk while he was waiting for a cab. And I pitched the heck out of Shilpa story, which he is going to do. Also, as our conversations continued afterwards, he picked up on 2 other transplant stories, which are also going to be separate episodes. So we have 3 national radio episodes coming with him on White Coat Black Art, from a 3-minute opportunity on a sidewalk to just like pitch him some stuff. So we make and they're pretty cool. One of them's my story. Okay, this is what we've covered in the last 80 minutes. We hope this was super tremendously helpful. And we have 7 minutes and 45 seconds left, Erica. Do you have questions for us?
When I was there, you would be approached in your room and you're like, okay. But then when you learned that it was a training hospital and all this research was going on, but I think if we prepare patients for that, that would be good. So I'd like to see some kind of key messages that we can share. And if we can do it with researchers together, that would be great. It goes back to the knowledge translation I was talking about yesterday.
I have a question for you, Sandra. No, you said raising awareness, and it triggered me.
Sorry, but we do for a reason. Yeah.
What is the purpose?
To get more people to register to be organ donors. Thank you.
Thank you. When it comes to, so to answer your question though about, are we able to speak on behalf of CDTRP? When we're invited, right? And so when we're invited, and when there's a context, and when there's maybe a researcher or a theme speaking about what they're doing, and they're looking for a patient partner as well. So would we go out and just say, I'm representing CDTRP right now? Right? I wouldn't go out and say I'm representing UHN. I would say I had surgery at UHN, but I wouldn't say I'm representing UHN. So in that instance where any of us are invited to speak alongside a clinician about CDTRP, et cetera, absolutely, there would be time to prepare, to sit together. How do I share elements of my story that are relevant right now? And what are those relevant pieces? Less so for patients' key messages, right? Those tends to fall more to the official sort of clinician or institutional spokesperson. Yeah. Elaine, Elaine.
Yeah.
Well, it's more a question to the audience. So, this was great, an hour and a half. I mean, frankly, there was so much information. It's not like a 10-minute refresher. I'm going to forget this by the time I hit the door, and then I get interviewed somewhere in January. And then there's new people coming on, new PFDs. How do we make this recurrent? How do we create a system, CDTRP shared with other groups, to make this accessible quickly, fast for all of us all the time? How do we do that? Anyone? no one disagrees with me, right? So we need to figure out how to do this. Like that people put in a lot of time here. We can't ask them every time. Just call Heather. She'll walk you through it.
Wait, you also have Patty.
Yeah, I have a great comms person at CHIO. But you know, this stuff needs to be practiced. That's the other thing. Like maybe there are simulations that we could do. Maybe there's right.
And Heather and I talked about this. Real media training is generally a full day event, and there probably maybe 2 to 3 people in the room, and you have a giant scary TV camera in there, and you do practice interviews, and you really put people through the ringer so that they remember. And that's not obviously something that can be done on the scale that we're trying to do today. So you're right, it is a teaser. It's a very short sort of introduction into media training, and more, I think, if it gives you something to think about, then that's the start. But you're right, it's not, unless you practice it all the time, it's still going to be a complete, and honestly, people who do interviews all the time are still complete nervous wrecks before they actually do an interview. But if you could even remember just 1 or 2 things when next time you do an interview, I think that's a win. And I just wanted to, Sandra, when you asked that question about representing CDTRP, I think what I want to emphasize here, though, is, to be honest with you, the relationship that you have with whatever affiliations you might have are actually not interesting to a reporter / the public. What they want to hear is your story. So you're there, sure, you may actually be a representative of CDTRP, or you're representing this research paper or this research team, but what they want to talk to you about is your story and the relevance to you. So it's just like when researchers will say things like, well, we'd really like to thank all our funding partners. Sure, feel free to say, this couldn't have been possible but without blah, 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 blah. But let me tell you, it will not get into the story, because the reporter is thinking of, what does the public want to know? The public doesn't really care how your research was funded. And I know that's a crucial piece of the world of research, is funding. But how you can make your funders happy is by getting your story out in the public. And they don't need the thank you, because you will thank them and say, thank you for all the great support you've given me. Look at this great coverage we've gotten. So you have to think about what's actually important to the person that you're talking to, rather than what you think is important.
No, first of all, thank you both for this incredible presentation. I mean, it's been a single most informative thing that I've heard about anything related to media and communicating and sort of key messages. So I think I just want to echo Sani's remarks. I think this, I was just overwhelmed. I was like halfway through, I was just texting Katie and said, hey, is there going to be slides available? Because I'm tired. There's no point. I was taking a picture of every slide. So, but there was also stuff behind it, and I was like, this is not helpful. I'm gonna have to rewatch the videos. So I think a couple of thoughts here. Flipping it back to you, what are your key messages from, and how can you perhaps dissect some of this talk and turn into some trainable curriculum in the next, over the next year, where we can participate, practice, and learn. The other thing is, I was thinking about all the different projects we're involved in individually as scientists, and this is a research and science organization, right? First and foremost. And so, even within CDTRP today, we've been talking about donor intervention trials and NRP work that I'm personally involved in. There's a lot of other great projects going on. Can we perhaps work with you guys to get some training on drafting those key messages? Can we create some landing pages and sort of, you just could keep how do we build on specific things that we have here and start learning these skills?
Do you know who the comps people are at your institution, at your university, at your hospital? I mean, that is the #1 question. So you should know them really well if you're a researcher and if you're doing a lot of interesting stuff. You should get to know them. You should have their email addresses inside your email so that it just pops up. They are your front line of communications expertise. So get to know them. If you don't, call them up. say, let's go for coffee. Here's some really amazing things I'm working on. How can we work with each other? Because they also want to know what's happening. That was my biggest complaint working at the research institutes. Worked at 2 of them. The number one thing was there were certain researchers who were really, really great at saying, hey, Elaine, I've got this really cool thing coming out in a couple months. Do you think it's worth something? And then there were so many other ones. It wouldn't be like that video game story. It wouldn't be until we saw it come out in publication or a media outlet would call us, heaven forbid, and say, hey, there's this really cool research. Can I do an interview on it? And we knew nothing about it. So that is going to be your number one way to get more communications expertise. Like Heather and I would love to help every single one of you guys, but we have jobs. So
you can hire me.
Yeah, you can hire Heather. You cannot hire me.
I have quite a bit of interaction with the philanthropy environment. And when you start getting these really positive messages associated with your institution out there in the media, it can help leverage future philanthropic opportunity as well, if the brand gets out there. So that's another thing to think about too, as a corollary. So one more question. We're almost out of time. One more. We are. Let's have lots of dialogue after. But thank you, Elaine and Heather. This has been fantastic. Key messages, impact, be prepared. And think about Thanksgiving dinner and no one on my floor is coding. Okay, off to lunch.